Before we begin tonight, I want you to do something for me. I want you to close your eyes, or let them go soft and unfocused, and I want you to listen to the rain. Just for a moment. Just breathe. Feel wherever you are resting. Feel the weight of your body, the warmth around you, the quiet of the room. The world outside is still going. Cars are passing somewhere. Someone somewhere is sending a text message or washing a dish or letting a dog back inside from the yard. The ordinary machinery of life is still running. But in here, in this space between you and whatever you are lying on, everything is slower. Everything is softer. Now stay right there, in that soft and quiet place. Because tonight I am going to tell you a story, and it is a long one. It will take us through decades and across an entire state and through the minds of investigators and victims and one ordinary-looking man who was not ordinary at all. It is a story about evil that hides in plain sight. It is a story about the people who refuse to stop looking for it. And it is, ultimately, a story about what happens when the world finally finds what it has been hunting for. This story is true. Every name, every date, every detail I give you tonight is drawn from court records, law enforcement testimony, investigative reporting, and the accounts of people who lived through what you are about to hear. There is nothing invented here. Sometimes the truth is stranger and darker and more unsettling than anything a writer could manufacture. This is one of those times. So get comfortable. Let your breathing find its own rhythm. Let the rain do what rain does. And let me begin. Part 1. A town called Bath. There is a small town in the southern tier of New York State, in a county called Steuben, that most Americans have never heard of and never will. It sits in a valley between gentle hills, the kind of hills that are not dramatic enough to be called mountains, but that give the land a soft, rolling quality, as if the earth itself is resting. The Cohocton River passes through it. There are old churches and old houses and a courthouse that was built in 1836, and in the middle of the 20th century, it was the kind of place where life moved at the pace that small American towns moved at, slowly, predictably, quietly. The town is called Bath. On November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, a woman named Kathleen Louise DeGroat gave birth to a baby boy. She and her husband Joseph James D'Angelo Sr. named the child after his father, Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. He was their third child and their first son. He would go on to become one of the most prolific and for a very long time one of the most elusive serial criminals in the history of the United States of America. But in November of 1945, none of that had happened yet. In November of 1945, he was just a newborn baby in a small town in New York, and the world had no way of knowing what he would eventually do to it. Joseph Sr. was a sergeant in the United States Army. This is important. Not because a military father automatically produces a violent son. That would be an absurd and unfair conclusion, and most children of military parents live perfectly ordinary, decent lives, but because a military father in that era meant certain things about the shape of a family's life. It meant moving. It meant following orders about where to be and when. It meant that home was not a fixed place on a map, but a condition that reassembled itself in different cities, different states, different countries, depending on where the Army needed Joseph Sr. to be. It meant that young Joseph Jr. would spend his childhood as something of a permanent outsider. A new kid, again and again and again. And there is something worth sitting with in that detail. Because the research on childhood instability, on what happens to children who are perpetually uprooted, who never form the kind of deep, durable friendships that come from growing up in one place, who are always in the process of beginning again somewhere new, that research is not flattering. It does not mean that every child who moves frequently becomes dangerous. Most of them do not. But it does mean that the conditions for certain kinds of damage are present. The conditions for a particular type of loneliness, a particular type of anger, a particular inability to form connections with other people. Joseph Jr. had that. He also had something else. Something darker. Something that even his own family members would later describe, in the context of court proceedings, as a formative wound. Germany, and the thing that was witnessed. At some point in Joseph Jr.'s early childhood, when he was approximately 9 or 10 years old, according to a family member who later spoke about it, the D'Angelo family was stationed in West Germany. This was the 1950s, during the long American military presence in Europe that followed the Second World War, and it was not unusual for army families to be posted overseas for extended periods. While the family was stationed there, something happened in a warehouse near where they were living. Joseph Jr.'s younger sister, who was approximately 7 years old at the time, was raped by 2 airmen. And Joseph saw it. I want to pause here, because this detail is not something I offer lightly, or as an excuse for anything that came later. What Joseph James D'Angelo did as an adult cannot be excused. Nothing can excuse it. The hundreds of lives he damaged, the 13 people he murdered, the decades of terror he spread across an entire state, none of that is made acceptable by a wound sustained in childhood. Many children experience terrible things and do not become predators. Many people carry enormous pain without ever inflicting pain on others. But to understand a story fully, we have to understand its beginning. And the beginning of this story includes a small boy standing in a warehouse in Germany, witnessing something that no child should ever witness, something that would have shattered a child's sense of safety and order and the way the world is supposed to work. What does that do to a mind? What does that plant? We do not know exactly. We cannot know exactly. The psychology of violent offenders is complicated and contested, and no one theory fully explains what makes a person capable of what Joseph D'Angelo was eventually capable of. But the fact of what he witnessed, its existence, its presence in his early life, is part of the record. His family members confirmed it. His prosecutors acknowledged it. And so we hold it here, not as justification, but as fact. The other fact from his childhood that the court record contains is this: Joseph Jr. was abused by his father. His sister Rebecca would later confirm this during the proceedings against him. Joseph Sr., the authoritarian army sergeant, was not merely strict in the way that many fathers of that era were strict. He was, by the account of his own children, abusive, physical, explosive, the kind of father who leaves marks, and not just the visible kind. So here is the picture of the household Joseph Jr. grew up in. A father who hit, a mother who endured, a family that moved constantly, a childhood abroad that included something no child should ever see. And a boy who grew up without the anchors that most people take for granted. A stable home, a consistent community, a father whose presence was safe rather than threatening. This is where he started. This is the foundation on which everything else was built. Rancho Cordova and the high school years. By the late 1950s, the family had relocated to California. They settled in the Sacramento area, specifically in and around Rancho Cordova, an unincorporated community just east of Sacramento that in those years was the kind of place that suburban California produced in abundance. Tract houses, new roads, families moving from other places, building lives in the sun. It was not glamorous. It was not distinctive. It was the American suburban dream in its most affordable and ordinary form. Joseph Jr. attended Mills Junior High School in Rancho Cordova between 1959 and 1960. He later enrolled at Folsom High School, which sat about 15 miles to the northeast, near the edge of the Sierra Nevada foothills. He was, by the accounts that have been assembled over the years, an unremarkable student. Not particularly distinguished. Not particularly troubled on the surface. He played baseball. He had a ring finger that he would eventually lose part of in the Navy. He was tall, about 5 feet 10 inches, with a lean, athletic build. But there were things beneath the surface that the school records did not capture. Prosecutors would later assert, based on evidence gathered in the years after his arrest, that D'Angelo committed burglaries, mail theft, and animal cruelty during his teenage years. He tortured and killed animals. A detail that, in the context of what came later, takes on a particular and chilling significance. The torture of animals in adolescence is one of the most consistent early indicators that forensic psychologists have identified in the histories of violent offenders. It is not proof of anything on its own, but it is a pattern, and it was present. He graduated or obtained a GED in 1964, and then he followed in his father's footsteps in the way that sons sometimes do even when they resent their fathers, even when the father has given them every reason to want to be different. He joined the military. Part 2, The Making of a Soldier. In September of 1964, Joseph James D'Angelo Jr. enlisted in the United States Navy. He was 18 years old. The Vietnam War was escalating. President Lyndon Johnson had just signed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the executive branch sweeping authority to expand American military involvement in Southeast Asia, and the draft was beginning to reach into the lives of young men across the country. Some enlisted to get ahead of it. Some enlisted because it was what men in their families did. Some enlisted because they had no better plan, and the Navy was a plan. We do not know precisely why D'Angelo enlisted, but he did, and he served for 22 months as a damage control man, a role that involved managing and repairing damage to a ship, fighting fires, handling flooding, maintaining the structural integrity of the vessel under conditions of combat or emergency. It was physical, demanding work. It required a particular kind of steadiness under pressure. He served aboard 2 vessels, the USS Canberra, a guided missile cruiser, and the USS Piedmont, a destroyer tender. Both were active in the waters around Vietnam during a period when American involvement in the conflict was intensifying. He was in a war zone. He experienced, at minimum, the proximity of violence and the constant low-level threat that military service in a war zone produces. It was during his naval service that he lost part of his ring finger. The circumstances are not fully documented in the public record. What we know is that he came back from the Navy missing part of a finger, a detail that would later become one of many physical characteristics used to create the composite profile of the unknown attacker investigators were hunting in the 1970s. He was discharged from the Navy in 1966. He was 20 years old. The war was continuing without him, and he came home to California with the particular combination of things that many Vietnam-era veterans came home with: a skill set shaped by military training, an intimate familiarity with danger and discipline, a body that had been conditioned to operate under stress, and, for at least some of them, a psychological landscape altered by what they had seen and done and experienced. What Joseph D'Angelo's inner landscape looked like after 2 years of naval service in a war zone, we cannot say with precision. We can say that he enrolled in college shortly afterward, pursuing the specific thing that would define the next phase of his life: law enforcement. Sierra College, and the woman named Bonnie. In 1968, Joseph D'Angelo enrolled at Sierra College in Rocklin, California, a community college about 20 miles northeast of Sacramento. He was studying police science. He was, by all outward appearances, a focused, serious young man with a clear professional direction. He had served his country. He was pursuing an education. He was, at Sierra College, the kind of returning veteran that institutions of higher education were trying to accommodate in those years. A little older than most of the undergraduates, more worldly, more certain of himself. It was at Sierra College that he met Bonnie Jean Colwell. Bonnie was 18 years old when D'Angelo approached her on campus. She was studying nursing. She was, by her own later description, an ordinary young woman navigating ordinary young life, going to classes, figuring out who she was, open to the world in the way that 18-year-olds tend to be when the world has not yet given them specific reasons to close. D'Angelo was 23, 5 years older, a Vietnam veteran, confident, worldly. To Bonnie, by her own account, he seemed energetic, interesting, the kind of man who had been places and done things that the other boys at Sierra College had not. They began dating, and very quickly, the red flags appeared. Though Bonnie, at 18, did not yet have the experience or the vocabulary to call them what they were. He was controlling, not dramatically so at first, not in ways that were easy to name or confront, but in the particular, grinding way that controlling men often begin, gradually, so gradually that the person on the receiving end adjusts to each increment of pressure without noticing how far from normal they have drifted. He was demanding about her time. He was possessive about her attention. He had fixed ideas about how things should be and an intolerance for deviation from those ideas. He took her on hunting trips. She did not want to go. He took her anyway. She later described watching him kill animals on those trips and feeling something she could not quite articulate at the time, a discomfort that went beyond mere squeamishness, a sense that the way he related to the act of killing was not entirely normal. His sexual behavior was, by her account, relentless and sometimes painful. She described him as insatiable, demanding hours-long sexual encounters that she found exhausting and uncomfortable while he played music by the Doors on repeat, seeming oblivious or indifferent to her discomfort. She later said she had no reference point at the time to understand that what she was experiencing was not ordinary. She did not know yet what ordinary was. He gave her a ring. Their engagement was announced in the Auburn Journal in May of 1970. The announcement noted that no definite date had been set for the wedding. It also noted that D'Angelo was affiliated with the Veterans Club, the Honor Society, the President's Honor Roll, and the International Diving Association. He was, on paper, a man who was going somewhere. A decorated, disciplined, ambitious young veteran pursuing a career in law enforcement. But Bonnie was paying attention to something the paper could not print. She was paying attention to who he was when no one else was looking. She ended the engagement in the spring of 1971. She would later say she could not even remember him formally proposing. The ring had simply appeared, and the assumption of marriage had been his, not hers. And when she finally looked clearly at the full picture of who this man was, she made a decision. She was done. Joseph D'Angelo did not take it well. Days after she ended things, a few days, no more than 2 weeks by her account, she woke up in the night to the sound of tapping at her bedroom window. She lay still in the dark. The tapping continued. She got up and looked. It was Joseph, and he was pointing a gun at her face. He told her to get dressed. He said they were going to Reno. It was not a request. Bonnie's father was in the house. She ran to her father's room and woke him. Her father went outside and confronted D'Angelo. Something in that confrontation, the presence of an older man, an authority, a witness, was enough. D'Angelo left. He never appeared at Bonnie's window again. She went on with her life. She married another man, a Sacramento accountant, in August of 1972. The wedding was attended by more than 125 people. She became Bonnie Ueltzen. She eventually became a travel blogger. She thought she had left Joseph D'Angelo behind. She had not. The name he called out in the dark. This detail, the name, the specific name, would surface years later in a way no one could have predicted. During at least one of the attacks attributed to the East Area rapist, the assailant was heard by his victim screaming, "I hate you, Bonnie. I hate you, Bonnie." Over and over. In the dark. In the middle of an attack on a woman who was not Bonnie. On a woman who had nothing to do with Bonnie Colwell or Sierra College or any of it. Investigators noted the name. They filed it. They carried it for years, wondering who Bonnie was, whether she was a mother or a wife or a girlfriend or a childhood memory, whether she held the key to something that would eventually unlock the identity of the man they were hunting. Retired Contra Costa County investigator Paul Holes, one of the most dedicated hunters of the Golden State Killer over the decades, later said that the name had always been significant. "We always thought that our offender had a Bonnie that was significant in his life," Holes said, "either a mother, a wife, an ex-wife, a girlfriend. We don't know, but that was something we would look for when evaluating potential suspects." When they finally identified D'Angelo in 2018 and began building out the picture of his life, they found the 1970 engagement announcement in the Auburn Journal almost immediately. They found Bonnie Colwell, and the picture snapped into focus. The theory, advanced by Holes and others, is this: Bonnie Colwell's rejection was one of the defining wounds of D'Angelo's adult life. She saw through him. She refused him. She chose someone else. And whatever was already unstable in Joseph D'Angelo, whatever damage the childhood had done, whatever the war had altered, whatever combination of wounds and entitlement and rage had been building, the rejection by Bonnie Colwell appears to have been a detonator. He married another woman shortly after, a woman named Sharon Huddle, whom he wed in 1973. But the marriage, by all accounts, was not a happy one. They separated in the mid-1990s, though they would not officially divorce until 2019 after his arrest. Their relationship was described by those familiar with it as toxic. He was, by the account of people who knew the family, a difficult, volatile, controlling presence in the home. He had 3 daughters with Sharon. His eldest daughter would later describe him as a perfect father. Perhaps to her, in certain moments, he was. The capacity to be functional and even loving in one part of life while being monstrous in another is one of the most disturbing features of cases like this one. It is a compartmentalization that defies the expectations we bring to how evil is supposed to work. We expect it to be visible. We expect it to leak into every corner. But Joseph D'Angelo was, by the testimony of people who knew him in daily life, an ordinary man. A quiet man. A man who mowed his lawn on Saturdays. And for a decade, behind that ordinary face, he was something else entirely. Part 3. The Man with a Badge. In 1971, the same year that Bonnie Colwell ended their engagement, Joseph D'Angelo transferred from Sierra College to California State University, Sacramento State, as most people call it, where he continued studying criminal justice. He graduated with a bachelor's degree. He completed an internship at the Roseville Police Department. He was assembling, credential by credential, the professional identity of a law enforcement officer. In 1973, he was hired as a police officer in Exeter, California. Exeter is a small city in the San Joaquin Valley, about 220 miles south of Sacramento, in the agricultural heartland of California's Central Valley. It sits in Tulare County, in the flat, sun-baked land between the Sierra Nevada to the east and the Coast Ranges to the west. In 1973, it was a quiet community of about 6,000 people, surrounded by orange groves and dairy farms, the kind of place where the pace of life was slow and the police department was small, and being a police officer meant knowing most of the people you were supposed to be protecting. Joseph D'Angelo wore the badge. He patrolled the streets. He responded to calls. He was, as far as anyone in Exeter knew, a dedicated officer who took his work seriously. He was promoted to sergeant in 1976 and placed in charge of the Exeter Police Department's Joint Attack on Burglary program. Read that again. The man who was, at that very same time, committing burglaries, the man who would become one of the most prolific residential burglars in California history, was placed in charge of a program designed to stop burglaries. In all the decades of this story, in all the layers of irony and dark coincidence that define it, this might be the single most extraordinary detail. He used his position to study the investigation methods being used against him. He used the knowledge he gained as a law enforcement officer to evade the law enforcement officers who were looking for him. He knew what evidence to leave and what evidence to erase. He knew how investigators thought. He knew their resources and their limitations. He was, quite literally, on both sides of the wall at the same time. Exeter is about 12 miles from Visalia. And in Visalia, beginning in April of 1974, something was happening. The Visalia ransack. If you drove through Visalia, California in the spring of 1974, you would have seen nothing unusual. It was a mid-sized Central Valley city of about 40,000 people, a regional hub in the agricultural economy of Tulare County, with a downtown and a college, the College of the Sequoias, and neighborhoods of modest homes on quiet streets. The kind of place, in other words, that seemed entirely immune to the sort of thing that was about to happen to it. Between April 1974 and December 1975, a total of 101 homes were burglarized in Visalia by an unknown perpetrator. 101 residential burglaries over less than 2 years. The police department was baffled, not only by the number of crimes but by their peculiar character. This was not a typical burglar. A typical burglar takes things of value. Electronics, jewelry, things that can be sold, things that have a clear monetary worth. The perpetrator in Visalia took things that made no sense from a financial perspective. Single earrings, not pairs, just the single earring, leaving its match behind. Photographs from family albums. Small, personal mementos. Items of obvious sentimental value to their owners but of no value to anyone else. He also left things. He would scatter women's underwear around the rooms of the homes he entered. He would rummage through drawers and leave the contents strewn across the floor. He would sometimes eat food from the refrigerator. There were reports of a particular fondness for ice cream, as if he were comfortable enough in the homes of strangers to pause and have a snack. He vandalized, seemingly for the pleasure of it. There was a quality to the crimes that was not about money at all. It was about something else. Something harder to name. Power. Control. The particular pleasure of being in someone else's private space without their knowledge or consent, moving through their things, touching their objects, taking pieces of their lives. Investigators began to build a profile of the suspect. He was athletic. He gained entry to homes through windows and tight spaces that required agility and strength. He was methodical. The crimes followed recognizable patterns. He was patient. He would burglarize a home only when its occupants were away, suggesting he watched and waited and chose his moments carefully. He left almost no forensic evidence. He was careful in a way that suggested either training or an unusual degree of natural cunning. And while all of this was happening, 12 miles away in Exeter, a police sergeant named Joseph D'Angelo was going to work every morning. The ransacker's crimes escalated over the course of 1975. He began making attempts on homes that were occupied. He was pushing the boundaries of what he had been doing, testing how far he could go. In the summer and fall of 1975, there were attempted break-ins at occupied residences that had the particular feeling of a man who was growing bored of burglary and building toward something else. And then, on the night of September 10, 1975, it stopped being about burglary. The night Claude Snelling died. Professor Claude Snelling was a journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias in Visalia. He was 45 years old. He had a wife. He had a 16-year-old daughter named Elizabeth. On the night of September 10, 1975, the Visalia ransacker broke into the Snelling home. Elizabeth was asleep in her room when she woke to find a man lying on her. In the immediate confusion of waking from sleep to find a masked stranger in her bed, she managed to fight back. She screamed. The noise woke her father, who came running. Claude Snelling confronted the intruder near the carport area of his home and discovered that the man was attempting to drag his daughter away. He was kidnapping Elizabeth, taking her somewhere with a purpose that any parent's imagination fills in immediately and horrifyingly. Claude Snelling did what fathers do. He rushed forward to stop it. The intruder shot him. Twice. Elizabeth later described the moments that followed. The man turned the gun on her as she crouched on the ground, and she was certain she was going to die. And then, instead of shooting her, the attacker began hitting her in the head with the gun and kicking her. And then he ran. Claude Snelling died from his wounds on the way to the hospital. Elizabeth survived. The Snelling murder was the last crime attributed to the Visalia ransacker in Visalia. About 2 months after Claude Snelling's death, the burglaries simply stopped. Visalia exhaled. The investigation continued. The detectives kept working, but the crimes had ceased. Many assumed the perpetrator had left town or had been scared off by the violence of what he had done. He had not been scared off. He had simply moved. Joseph D'Angelo, who was working as a police officer 12 miles away in Exeter, who had been charged with running a burglary prevention task force, who was aware of every development in the ransacker investigation because such information naturally circulated among law enforcement in the region, Joseph D'Angelo had decided that Visalia was finished. The heat was rising. The profile of the investigation was growing. It was time for a new territory. The gun that killed Claude Snelling was later traced by ballistic evidence to a weapon that had been stolen during one of the Visalia ransacker burglaries. The killer had used a victim's own gun, or a gun stolen from another victim, to commit the murder. It was one more piece of the puzzle that would eventually, through the painstaking work of investigators over decades, help establish the connection between the Visalia ransacker and the man who came next. Elizabeth Snelling grew up. She became Elizabeth Hupp. And 43 years after the night her father died, when the DNA evidence pointed to Joseph D'Angelo as the Visalia ransacker, she stood before cameras and said, "In my heart, I believe he's the one, and that my father was his first victim." I believe she is right. Part 4. The world that made the East Area rapist possible. Before we follow Joseph D'Angelo north to Sacramento, I want to spend some time in the world he was moving into. Because to understand how he did what he did, how he did it for as long as he did it, to as many people as he did it, you need to understand the world of suburban California in the mid-1970s. You need to understand what it was and what it was not. California in 1976 was still riding the long wave of the post-war suburban expansion that had transformed the state since the 1940s. Vast tracts of flat land east of Sacramento had been subdivided and built upon in the 1950s and 1960s, creating communities like Rancho Cordova and Carmichael and Citrus Heights, places with names that sounded pleasant and unremarkable, places made of single-family homes with lawns and driveways and backyards. Places where the houses all looked roughly similar and the streets curved in the gentle arcs that suburban planners favored. These neighborhoods were built for privacy. That was part of their appeal. After the density of city living, after apartments and shared walls and neighbors who could hear every conversation, the suburban dream was space. Your own space. A yard. A garage. Windows that looked out not onto someone else's building but onto your own patch of grass. But privacy, it turned out, had a shadow side. The same features that made these neighborhoods feel safe and private also made them remarkably easy to disappear into. There were almost no streetlights in many of the residential areas east of Sacramento in 1976. There was number 911 service. The emergency telephone number system was still being implemented across the United States and had not yet reached many California communities. Home security systems were expensive and rare. There were no surveillance cameras, no Ring doorbells, no motion-activated floodlights. If something happened to you after dark, in the privacy of your own home, the only people who might know about it were whoever was inside that home. The houses themselves were sometimes designed in ways that made them vulnerable. Picture windows, large glass panels that let in light and gave a sense of openness, also gave anyone standing outside a clear view of the interior. Sliding glass doors to patios and backyards, fashionable in California design of that era, were notoriously easy to bypass. Windows left open on warm California nights offered entry points to anyone patient enough to find them. And the community itself, the social fabric of these neighborhoods, was thinner than it appeared. The Press Democrat, in a later analysis of the conditions that allowed the East Area rapists to operate, noted that in these suburban neighborhoods, residents who saw a prowler in a neighbor's backyard often just pulled the blinds. There were few reasons to know your neighbors well. There was no great civic life that pulled people together. People went to work, came home, closed the garage door, and watched television. The community was, in a meaningful sense, a collection of private islands that happened to be located next to each other. This is the world Joseph D'Angelo moved into in 1976. A world built for privacy. A world without adequate light or communication infrastructure. A world whose social isolation made witnesses unlikely and community response nearly impossible. A world that was, in the most unfortunate sense, exactly suited to what he intended to do. What the 1970s were and were not. There is another dimension of that world that deserves attention, and it is an uncomfortable one. The 1970s were a decade of changing attitudes toward women and sexuality in the United States, but the courts and the law enforcement apparatus had not caught up with those changes. Marital rape was not a crime in California in 1976. The idea that a woman could be raped by her husband, could not consent or refuse within the context of marriage, had not yet been codified in the state's criminal statutes. It would not be until 1979 that California criminalized marital rape, and even then, the law included exceptions and limitations that reflected how recently and reluctantly the culture had begun to take women's bodily autonomy seriously. For law enforcement, rape cases in 1976 were handled with a degree of skepticism that would be unacceptable today. Victims were questioned in ways that reflected doubt about their truthfulness, about their behavior before the attack, about what they might have done to invite what happened to them. The investigation of sexual assault was not what it would later become. Evidence collection was inconsistent. Forensic science had not yet developed the tools, particularly DNA analysis, that would eventually make it possible to definitively connect a suspect to a crime scene. And there was the specific indignity of being asked, again and again, to describe something that was among the most traumatic experiences of your life to a law enforcement system that was not always certain whether what you were describing was actually a crime. Sacramento's news media, in those years, barely mentioned rape at all. It was not considered appropriate subject matter for the newspaper or the evening news. When reports of the East Area rapist first appeared in community meetings rather than news broadcasts, it was partly because neither law enforcement nor the media knew quite how to handle a story that required acknowledging, publicly, that women were being attacked in their homes in large numbers. When the story did break into the press, it spread with the velocity of something long suppressed. The fear that the Sacramento community had been quietly carrying was suddenly public, and it was enormous. People started sleeping with shotguns by the bed. Locksmiths reported that their businesses went way out of control from the demand for new locks. Women who lived alone made arrangements to stay with friends or family. Gun sales increased. Dog ownership increased. The community was reorganizing itself around a threat it couldn't see and couldn't name. And through all of it, Joseph D'Angelo went to work. He pinned his badge to his chest. He got in the patrol car. He responded to calls. He filed reports. He was, to everyone who worked alongside him and everyone who passed him on the street, a police officer doing his job. Part 5, Exeter to Auburn. The badge, the burglaries, and the escalation. In 1976, Joseph D'Angelo was promoted to sergeant at the Exeter Police Department and transferred to the Auburn Police Department in the Sierra Nevada foothills, northeast of Sacramento. Auburn was, and still is, a small city with a history stretching back to the California Gold Rush, with a picturesque old town and the kind of quiet, settled quality that small California foothill communities tend to have. It was a step up in some ways, a larger department, a higher profile role. He was living in Citrus Heights, the Sacramento suburb that would become the center of so many of the crimes attributed to the East Area rapist in the years to come. He was commuting to Auburn to work. He was married to Sharon Huddle. They had wed in 1973, and the early years of their marriage were, by the limited accounts available, functional if not particularly warm. And he had already made his decision. Whatever internal threshold he had been approaching since the early 1970s, since Bonnie's rejection, since the escalating burglaries in Visalia, since the night he put a bullet in Claude Snelling, he had crossed it. He was no longer testing. He was no longer building toward something. He had arrived. In June of 1976, the East Area rapist committed his first documented attack in Sacramento County. He would not stop for 3 years. How he chose them. Before we get to the attacks themselves, and we will get to them, in the careful, deliberate detail that the people who survived them deserve, I want to explain how he operated. Because his methodology was not impulsive. It was not the crime of a desperate or disorganized person. It was the product of planning and patience and a degree of cold calculation that investigators would come to regard with a kind of appalled professional respect. He stalked his victims for days, sometimes weeks. He would identify a target neighborhood and walk through it in the evenings, in the dark, sometimes wearing dark clothing and gloves, sometimes carrying a flashlight that he would press against the lens to dim it to almost nothing. He would observe which homes had single women living in them. He would note which households had a male partner who might need to be controlled before he could reach the woman. He would note the layout of the house, where the windows were, which ones were accessible, which parts of the property were dark, and which were visible from the street. Then he would prepare. He would sometimes break into a home in advance of an attack, not to commit the crime yet, but to stage it. He would unlock a window from the inside, so he could open it quietly on the night he returned. He would hide lengths of shoelace or cord or twine under beds or behind furniture, material he would use later to bind his victims. He was prepositioning his tools in the homes of people who were sleeping in those same homes, people who had no idea that the next time this man was in their house, everything would be different. On the night of an attack, he would typically strike between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. He would enter through the unlocked window he had prepared or through a door he could bypass. He moved in silence. Victims described hearing nothing, no creak of a floorboard, no rustle of a curtain, until he was already in the room. Until there was a light in their eyes and a voice telling them not to move or they would die. He was wearing a mask, always a mask, sometimes a ski mask, sometimes a cloth mask with holes cut out. His face was never seen clearly by any of his victims. He carried a knife, sometimes a gun. He was prepared to use both. In the early phase of his Sacramento crimes, he targeted women who lived alone or who were home without a male partner present. He would bind them, take what he wanted, and leave. As his confidence grew and his appetite expanded, he shifted to targeting couples. And this, from the perspective of sheer psychological cruelty, was where the methodology became particularly distinctive. The dishes on the back. When he found a couple in the home, a husband and wife, a boyfriend and girlfriend, he would incapacitate the male partner first. He would wake the man from sleep, threaten him, and tie his hands and feet with the cord or shoelace he had already prepared. Then he would take the man to the floor or position him face down on the bed. And then, and this detail is in the documented accounts of multiple victims, and it is as cold and deliberate as anything in this case, he would stack dishes on the man's back. Plates from the kitchen, sometimes cups as well. He would tell the man that if the dishes moved, if he heard them fall or shift, he would come back into the room and kill the man. And then he would take the woman to another room. Think about what this requires. Think about what it means to lie face down on your own bedroom floor, in the dark, with your hands and feet bound, with a stack of ceramic plates balanced on your back, listening to what is happening in the next room and knowing that any movement you make, any instinctive lurch toward helping, toward doing something, toward the most primal human impulse, which is to protect the person you love, might cause the dishes to fall. And if the dishes fall, the man in the mask with the knife will come back. And you cannot know what he will do. It is a mechanism of paralysis so specifically calibrated to human psychology that it reads as the product of a mind that had spent real time thinking about how to most completely dominate another person. Not just physically, psychologically, completely. He would be in the home for hours. Victims reported that he ate food from their kitchens. He would go to the refrigerator, take out food, eat while they were tied and helpless. He rifled through their drawers and their belongings. He took personal items, a single earring, a coin, a photograph, the same kind of inexplicable trophies he had been taking during the Visalia burglaries. He moved through the home with the unhurried confidence of someone who was not afraid of being found. Because he knew he wouldn't be. He had planned for that. And when he was finally done, he would leave as silently as he had arrived. Out the window he had prepared, into the dark, back to his car, wherever he had parked it, back to his life. Part 6, June 18, 1976, the first attack. It is summer. It is California. The air is warm and dry and carries the smell of cut grass and car exhaust and the faint mineral tang of the Sacramento Valley in June. Phyllis Henneman is 22 years old. She lives in Rancho Cordova, the Sacramento suburb where she grew up. She is living alone. Her mother died 18 months earlier, and her father is out of town. She goes to bed. She wakes up to find a man standing in her bedroom doorway. He is wearing a ski mask. He is holding a 4-inch knife. He jumps onto her bed and presses the blade against her right temple. The pressure is hard enough to cut her, a small wound near her eyebrow that she will carry for the rest of her life. He ties her up with cord he has brought with him and with a fabric belt he finds in her closet. This is the first attack officially attributed to the East Area rapist. The first of 51. The first of what will become, over the next 3 years and then the next decade, a crime spree of a scale and duration that no one could have imagined on that June night in 1976. Phyllis Henneman, referred to by Michelle McNamara in her book as Sheila, in order to protect her identity at the time of writing, survived. She testified at D'Angelo's sentencing in 2020. Her sister read her victim impact statement aloud on her behalf, because Phyllis had died in the years since the attacks but before D'Angelo was ever identified. She never knew in life who had done this to her. That matters. That is part of what this story is. The summer and fall of 1976. After June 18th, the attacks came with a frequency that was disorienting to the investigators trying to respond to them. There were attacks in July, in August, in September, in October, 2 in a single day, in November, in December. On July 17th, 2 sisters were attacked at their Sacramento County home. Peggy Frink, who would eventually come forward and give a victim impact statement at D'Angelo's sentencing in 2020, more than 40 years after the attack, was 15 years old. Her sister Sue was 16. They were, as Frink later said in court, just high school kids living a normal life. They were bound so tightly that their hands remained numb for months after the attack. D'Angelo beat Peggy in the head so hard that she had difficulty brushing her hair for a long time afterward. She said that even 44 years later, she still does not feel safe. She remains hypervigilant. She has never fully stopped being afraid. On October 9th, a woman was raped in Rancho Cordova. On October 18th, he struck twice in a single day, one woman in Carmichael, another in Rancho Cordova, and is also believed to have been responsible for a carjacking in Carmichael the same day. On November 10th, an attack in Citrus Heights. On December 18, 1976, he attacked Chris McFarlane, then 15 years old, later known as Chris Pedretti. She was alone in the house practicing the piano in the living room when she heard a soft sound. It was fabric. He was already inside. She later came to believe he had been hiding in the closet, waiting for her to be alone for a sufficient stretch of time. She was just 10 minutes into being alone in the house. Her parents were at a holiday party. Her sister was at work. Her best friend had just left. 10 minutes, That was all the window he needed. By the end of 1976, he had committed 10 documented attacks in Sacramento County. In less than 6 months, the local press was beginning to report on the crimes, though the reporting was incomplete and the community's understanding of the scope of what was happening was still forming. Investigators had a name for him, the East Area Rapist, for the geographic pattern of the initial crimes in the eastern suburbs of Sacramento, but they did not have a face. They did not have a name. They had almost nothing. Part 7, 1977, The Escalation and the Taunting. The year 1977 was when the East Area Rapist stopped being a local problem and became a state emergency. The attacks continued through January, February, March. They accelerated. He was growing bolder, more practiced, more confident. The early attacks had targeted women alone or women with children. He was now increasingly targeting couples. The dishes on the back. The husband tied and helpless. The hours-long presence in the home. He was becoming more elaborate, more controlled, more theatrical in his cruelty. Investigators established a task force. Carol Daly, the sole female investigator on the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office at the time, was one of the key figures in the early investigation. She later described the work of reaching out to victims, of trying to gather enough consistent description to build a profile of the attacker, of sitting with women who had survived something almost indescribable and trying to help them find words for it. She understood that the way the investigation was handled, with empathy, with respect for the survivors, was not just a moral imperative but an investigative necessity. Victims who felt believed and supported were more likely to provide the details that might eventually close the case. The profile that emerged was this: a white male, athletic build, approximately 5 feet 9 to 6 feet tall, with light brown or dirty blonde hair. He appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s. He had what seemed to be some knowledge of law enforcement. His care around evidence, his awareness of investigative procedures, suggested training or experience in that area. He drove some kind of vehicle, though no consistent description of it emerged. He was organized, patient, and capable of sustained silence. None of the physical descriptions noted a missing partial finger. The gloves he wore, always the gloves, prevented that detail from being observed. On March 18, 1977, 9 months after the first attack, something new happened. Police in Sacramento received phone calls from a man claiming to be the East Area Rapist. He taunted the investigators. He told them, "I have my next victim already stalked and you guys can't catch me." And that same day, March 18, 1977, the 15th attack took place. He had called to tell them it was coming, and then he had done it anyway, because there was nothing they could do to stop him. In December of 1977, he wrote letters. He wrote to the Sacramento Bee newspaper. He wrote to Sacramento's mayor. The letter contained a poem. He called it Excitement's Crave, and it included a line that has been quoted and analyzed ever since. Sacramento should make an offer to make a movie of my life that will pay for my planned exile. His planned exile. He was thinking about his endgame. He was considering, already in 1977, the possibility that eventually he would have to stop. That eventually the net would tighten. He was planning for it. And in the meantime, he was taunting the people who were trying to find him with a confidence that can only come from believing, absolutely, that they would not. The Maggiore murders. On February 2, 1978, something changed again. Brian and Katie Maggiore were 21 and 20 years old, respectively. They were newlyweds, a young couple living in the Rancho Cordova area of Sacramento. On that February evening, They were doing something entirely ordinary, walking their dog. They were shot and killed, both of them, in the street. The dog was unharmed. The murders appeared at first to be unconnected to the East Area rapist cases. Those crimes had been sexual assaults, not apparently random shootings on a public street. But investigators eventually determined that Brian and Katie Majori had likely encountered the East Area rapist while he was stalking or preparing for another attack in the neighborhood. They may have seen something. They may have been in the wrong place at the moment when someone who had already murdered Claude Snelling in Visalia was not prepared to leave witnesses behind. It would be nearly 40 years before investigators officially tied the Majori murders to the East Area rapist. But when the full DNA case was assembled against Joseph DeAngelo in 2018 and 2019, it included these two young people walking their dog in the dark on a February night in 1978. Brian was 21. Katie was 20. They had done nothing wrong. They had been in their own neighborhood on an ordinary evening, and they were killed for it. The Bay Area and the fear that spread. By late 1978, the East Area rapist had expanded his territory significantly. He had moved west and north into the Bay Area, the great metropolitan sprawl that surrounds San Francisco Bay. Attacks were reported in Concord, in San Jose, in Danville, in Fremont, in Walnut Creek, communities that had felt safe because they were not Sacramento, communities whose residents had followed the news of the East Area rapist from a comfortable distance, now found themselves inside the radius of his operation. The fear that had been specific to Sacramento, that particular, localized dread that had driven locksmiths out of business and put shotguns beside beds in the eastern suburbs, spread. It was now a Bay Area problem, a Northern California problem, a California problem. Investigators across multiple jurisdictions were now comparing notes, pooling resources, trying to find the thread that connected the crimes in Concord to the crimes in Sacramento. The profile of the suspect was being refined, updated, shared. But the crimes kept happening. The attacker kept moving. And the thread connecting all of it to a police officer in Auburn, California remained invisible. The last documented attack in the Bay Area attributed to the East Area rapist occurred in July of 1979. And then the attack stopped. Not because he had been caught. Not because he had died or become incapacitated. Not because anything the investigators had done had worked. He stopped because he had decided to stop. And he had decided to stop because, in October of 1979, something had happened that threatened to expose him. Part 8. The shoplifting, the firing, and the thing that comes next. In 1979, Joseph James DeAngelo, sergeant and police officer, was arrested for shoplifting. The items he stole from a drugstore in Auburn, California were a can of dog repellent and a hammer. The items were worth a few dollars. The arrest ended his career. The Auburn Police Department fired him. He was convicted of the theft and fined $100. A can of dog repellent, a hammer. These are the items that cost Joseph DeAngelo his badge. The dog repellent, investigators would later theorize, was likely intended to deter dogs during his burglaries and stalking operations. He was regularly prowling the yards and backyards of suburban homes in the dark, and dogs were a constant hazard. The hammer, well, a hammer has many uses. In the context of a man who was also a serial attacker, the uses are not difficult to imagine. He was fired. He lost the badge. The career he had built, the criminal justice degrees, the years of service, the promotions, was over. And the crimes stopped. At least, the crimes in Northern California stopped. There is a tempting psychological narrative here, and investigators have been careful about it. The idea that losing the badge, losing the official authority that came with law enforcement, was the thing that finally pushed D'Angelo over the edge from sexual assault to murder. The theory holds that while he had the badge, he had a legal outlet for his need for power and control. When it was taken away, the only way left to express that need was through escalating violence. Retired investigator Paul Holes advanced this theory. He noted that after D'Angelo was fired, all the subsequent murders attributed to him, 10 of the 13 total, occurred in Southern California, where he had no professional profile, no known history, no risk of running into former colleagues or people who recognized his face. What happened in the decade after his firing, in the years between 1979 and 1986, belongs to the next chapter of this story, to the original Night Stalker, to the murders in Santa Barbara and Ventura and Orange County, to the escalation into something darker still. But before we get there, I want to stay for a moment with the man who went home that night after being fired. The man who drove back to his house in Citrus Heights, to his wife Sharon, and whatever the state of their marriage was in 1979. The man who would, the next morning, have to figure out who he was without the badge. He got a job as a truck mechanic. He worked for 27 years at a distribution center for Save Mart supermarkets in Roseville, a Sacramento suburb. He went to work. He came home. He mowed his lawn. He raised 3 daughters. And in the hours between those ordinary things, he drove south. And he killed. Part 9. The Double Life, Mechanic by Day. There is something that people find particularly difficult to process about cases like this one, and I think it is worth spending some time with it because it is, in a way, the most important thing this story has to teach us. We have a cultural script for how evil is supposed to work. We expect it to be visible. We expect the signs to be there. We expect the serial killer to be strange, isolated, obviously disturbed. The person who never made eye contact, who made the neighbors uncomfortable, who everyone said afterward they always had a bad feeling about. We expect evil to announce itself. Joseph D'Angelo did not announce himself. Not in the ways we expect. His neighbors in Citrus Heights later described him as quiet, reserved, obsessed with his lawn. He was apparently meticulous about its maintenance in a way that registered as perhaps a bit intense, but certainly not alarming. He had a foul mouth, one neighbor noted, and could be short-tempered. But none of that is unusual. None of that rises to the level of warning sign. He had daughters who loved him. He was a grandfather. He was a retired mechanic. He had lived in the same modest 3-bedroom house in Citrus Heights for decades. He was, in every observable external dimension, a person who had simply lived his life and aged into the background of suburban California. He retired from Save Mart in 2017, just a year before his arrest. For 27 years, he went to that distribution center, did his job, came home. For 27 years, no one at work had any idea. No colleague, no supervisor, no one who saw him every day, who ate lunch near him, who said good morning to him in the parking lot, had any idea. He had compartmentalized so completely that the two halves of his life never touched each other in any visible way. This is the thing that matters. Not as a comfort, there is no comfort in it, but as a fact that has to be acknowledged and reckoned with. Because the lesson of Joseph D'Angelo is not that monsters are easy to identify. The lesson is that they are sometimes impossible to identify by the ordinary means we use to make judgments about people. He looked like a retired mechanic. He was also a man who had committed some of the worst crimes in California history. Those things were both true, simultaneously, for his entire adult life. Part 10. The 40 Years of Silence. After 1986, when the last crime attributed to the Golden State Killer occurred, the murder of an 18-year-old woman in Irvine, California, there was silence. He stopped. He went home to Citrus Heights. He went back to the distribution center. His daughters grew up. His marriage disintegrated into a separation that was never formalized as a divorce. The world changed around him. The 1980s gave way to the 1990s. The 1990s gave way to the 2000s. Technology advanced. The internet arrived. DNA science advanced beyond anything that had existed when he committed his last crime. And the investigators who were looking for him, the detectives and the cold case specialists, and eventually the citizen researchers who became obsessed with the case, kept working. They did not stop. Not entirely. Careers came and went, and some of the investigators who had worked the case in the 1970s retired and died. But the cases were never officially closed. The files sat in evidence rooms and cold case units, and every so often someone would pull them out and look at them again, wondering whether something had been missed, whether some new technology or some new analytical approach might find what the old ones could not. In 2001, DNA analysis finally confirmed what some investigators had long suspected. The East Area rapist in Sacramento and the original Night Stalker in Southern California were the same person. The same DNA profile connected crimes separated by geography and by the years that had passed between them. This was a significant moment in the investigation, though it did not produce an arrest. It produced instead a new understanding of the scope of what they were dealing with and a new name, eventually, for the perpetrator. In 2013, a true crime journalist and writer named Michelle McNamara gave him the name that would stick, the Golden State Killer. She wrote about him on her website, truecrimediary.com, which she had built into one of the most respected true crime resources online. She began writing a book about him. She interviewed investigators. She read through thousands of pages of police reports. She traveled to crime scenes. She embedded herself in the online communities of amateur researchers who had become as consumed by the case as she was. She was determined to find him, and she believed as 2016 arrived that she was getting close. Michelle McNamara died on April 21, 2016. She was 46 years old. She died in her sleep of an accidental drug interaction, a combination of medications that her medical examiners later attributed to the particular cocktail of prescription drugs she was taking, in part because the relentless research she was doing was taking a significant toll on her sleep and her mental health. She left behind a husband, the comedian and actor Patton Oswalt, and a young daughter, and a manuscript that was not yet finished. Her collaborators finished it. The book was published on February 27, 2018, nearly 2 years after her death, and in a piece of timing that would have meant everything to her, just 2 months before the arrest of the man she had spent years hunting. She never got to see it. I'll Be Gone in the Dark, her book is called. It is one of the most extraordinary pieces of true crime writing ever published. It is a love story in a strange and sad and particular way. A love story between a writer and a mystery, between an obsessive and the dark thing she could not stop chasing. It became a #1 bestseller. It became an HBO documentary. It has been read by millions of people. And the title comes from something the East Area rapist said to a victim during one of his attacks. A threat. A promise. A statement of his own invincibility in the darkness of a Sacramento suburb in the late 1970s. He was wrong. He was not gone in the dark. Not forever. Part 11. The Science That Closed In. By 2017, The case had been cold, truly deeply cold, for over 3 decades. The last known crime attributed to the Golden State Killer had been committed in 1986. 31 years had passed. Many of the original investigators had retired or died. The victims had aged. The physical evidence still sat in police property rooms and evidence lockers, sealed and catalogued, waiting for technology that did not yet exist when the crimes were committed to catch up to what the crimes had left behind. That technology was arriving. In 2017, investigators in California began working with a new approach to DNA analysis that had been developed primarily in the genealogy research community. It was called investigative genetic genealogy, and the basic principle was this: take an unknown DNA sample, in this case, the DNA left by the Golden State Killer at crime scenes in the 1970s and 1980s, and upload it to a public DNA database, the kind that millions of ordinary Americans had been voluntarily populating for years in order to trace their family histories and discover distant relatives. Because DNA is inherited, any sample in that database that partially matched the crime scene DNA would indicate a family connection. Not necessarily a direct connection. The matching individual might be a second cousin or a third cousin, someone several degrees removed from the actual suspect. But even a partial match provides a starting point. From that starting point, investigators could begin building a family tree, working outward from the matching individual, identifying potential branches of the family, and then narrowing down the candidates by cross-referencing age, location, physical characteristics, and any other information available from the public record. This technique had never been used in a murder investigation before. There were no established protocols. There were no precedents. There were significant ethical and privacy questions about using a database that millions of people had voluntarily joined for personal reasons as an instrument of criminal investigation, questions that are still being debated today and that touch on some of the most fundamental tensions in the modern world between personal privacy, genetic data, and the needs of law enforcement. But the investigators working the Golden State Killer case decided to try it. They uploaded the DNA profile. They searched the database. They found partial matches. They began building family trees from those matches, working backward and forward through generations, identifying the networks of relatives that the partial matches suggested. And gradually, through a process of meticulous elimination, ruling out candidates who were the wrong age, or who had lived in the wrong place, or who had died before the crimes occurred, they arrived at a name: Joseph James D'Angelo. He was 72 years old. He lived in a modest house in Citrus Heights, Sacramento, the same general area where so many of the crimes had taken place. He had been a police officer. He had studied criminal justice. He was the right age. He was the right height. The physical characteristics matched the composite profiles that had been built up over years of witness descriptions and forensic analysis. But they needed confirmation. They needed his actual DNA, not a partial match through a family member. And they needed to obtain it without alerting him, without giving him any reason to flee or destroy evidence or do anything that might jeopardize the case they were building. They put him under surveillance. They watched him for days. They followed him carefully, at a distance, noting his routines, identifying the moments when he might leave something behind. And eventually, the moment came. Joseph D'Angelo used a tissue, and he discarded it in a trash can outside his home. Investigators retrieved the tissue. They extracted the DNA from it, and they ran it against the Golden State Killer's crime scene profile. It was a perfect match, complete, unambiguous, indisputable. After 44 years, the ghost had a name. The mask had a face beneath it, and the face belonged to a 72-year-old retired mechanic who was living in the same suburb where some of the crimes had taken place, who had never moved away, who had never run, who had presumably spent every year of the previous 4 decades assuming, correctly, for a long time, that no one would ever find him. He was wrong. Part 12, April 24, 2018, The Arrest. It was a Tuesday morning in April. The kind of morning that California produces in abundance in the spring, clear and mild, the sky a pale and uncomplicated blue. In a suburb of Sacramento, an elderly man was at his home in Citrus Heights, moving through the routines of whatever day looked like for him now. Retired, 72 years old. A grandfather, a man who had spent 27 years as a truck mechanic and who had been home since 2017. Law enforcement arrived. Multiple officers. They came with weapons drawn and with the certainty that comes from weeks of surveillance and a DNA result that left no room for doubt. Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested at his home on April 24, 2018. The reaction from him was described by the officers who made the arrest as confused, disoriented, the reaction of an old man who perhaps had not fully reckoned, in the deep private part of himself where he kept his secret, with the reality that this moment could ever come. He reportedly muttered, almost to himself, "I don't know what's happening." He knew. Within hours, the news was spreading. The Golden State Killer had been identified. He had been arrested. He was a former police officer. He was 72. He had been living in Sacramento the whole time. The reaction was overwhelming. Investigators who had spent years, decades, on this case wept. Survivors who had been carrying what happened to them for 40 years and had given up hope of ever knowing who did it now suddenly had a face, a name, an answer. Families of the murdered victims, Brian and Katie Majori, Claude Snelling, and the 10 people killed in Southern California whose names we will get to in the volumes to come, were contacted and informed. Paul Holes, the retired investigator who had given decades to this case and who had retired from his career just 2 days before the arrest was made, learned the news from a phone call. He had spent years, decades, and he found out 2 days too late to be there when it happened. He cried anyway. He cried for a long time. Closing, A Night to Rest. There is so much more to tell. The next volume will take you into the Southern California murders, the original Night Stalker years, the 10 homicides that escalated what he was doing into something darker and more final than anything that came before. We will go into the courtroom and sit with the victims. We will hear what they said to him when they finally had the chance. We will follow the genetic genealogy investigation in detail, through all the steps and all the people and all the technology that led investigators to that single discarded tissue outside a house in Citrus Heights. We will sit with Michelle McNamara's work and her story. We will be in the room when Joseph D'Angelo finally spoke, in a broken old man's voice, the only 2 words that amounted to anything like an acknowledgement of what he had done. But that is the next volume. And right now, tonight, you have been listening for a long time. You have followed this story through a childhood in New York and a deployment to Vietnam and a college campus in Sacramento and a string of burglaries in a small Central Valley city and the first terrible summer of attacks in the Sacramento suburbs. You have been in those houses in some sense. You have felt the shape of the fear. And now I want you to let it go. Not permanently. The story will be here when you come back. The next volume will pick up exactly where this one leaves off, and we will take the next step together. But for tonight, you have heard enough. Your mind has taken in enough. And the most important thing now is to rest. The rain is still falling. Listen to it. Your body is heavy. Your breathing is slower than it was at the beginning of this. The weight of the day, whatever the day held, whatever you carried into this night, has softened around the edges. This is the work that sleep does. This is the body saying, enough, time to let go. So let go. Let the rain do what rain does. Let the darkness be simply the darkness. Let your thoughts drift without holding on to them, like clouds moving through a sky that is not troubled by their passing. You are safe. The story will wait. The world will hold itself together while you rest. Everything that needs to be resolved will still be there tomorrow. The answers that haven't come yet will come in their own time. Tonight is not for answers. Tonight is for rest. Sleep now. I'll be here when you come back.